Warrior Met Coal and Arch Resources. Which of them is a better investment right now? Well, that is what we are going to find out today. So why are we looking at those two specific companies? Well, there are two reasons. One, Mohnish Pabrai owns shares of both of them, and he's adding to those positions. And the other one is that we want to compare apples to apples, and those companies are both in the coal industry. But actually, there is an important difference between them. Warrior Met Coal exclusively mines metallurgical coal, crucial for steel production, and does not engage in thermal coal mining. Arch Resources, on the other hand, operates in two segments, metallurgical coal and also thermal coal, so they are more diversified. But that does not have to be a good thing, because it is very important to understand that, of course, the world has alternative energy sources besides thermal coal. But metallurgical coal is essential to the production of steel. So in the next few years, we may not use coal to produce energy, but we will use it to produce steel. And that is why a substantial part of Arch Resources may slowly disappear. And Warrior Met Coal is investing big in its future. In 2026, they should open a new mine called the Blue Creek, and it will provide access to one of the largest untouched metallurgical coal resources in North America. Okay, so we know a bit about the companies. Let's compare them. Individual insiders own 1.8% of Warrior Met Coal and almost 3.7% of Arch Resources. So when it comes to the management having its skin in the game, Arch Resources is a clear winner. And are individual insiders buying right now? That is a check for Warrior Met Coal and an X for Arch Resources. And do super investors own those companies? There are two super investors owning Warrior Met Coal, Mohnish Pabrai and Third Avenue Management. And the only super investor that owns shares of Arch Resources is Mohnish. So it is a win for Warrior Met Coal. And are super investors buying? That is a check for both companies. Mohnish bought Warrior Met Coal last quarter and added over 200% to Arch Resources. So now they both make up over 15% of his US portfolio. The final score when it comes to investors is 3 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. Return on invested capital. It is 25.2% for Warrior Met Coal and 23.2% for Arch Resources. So both returns are impressive, but Warrior is slightly better. And net profit margin? It is 28.5% for Warrior Met Coal and 14.7% for Arch Resources. So it's another check for Warrior Met Coal. And the difference is actually quite substantial. And now let's take a look at share buyback. Warrior Met Coal bought back 1.4% of its shares in the last 10 years, and Arch Resources bought back 12.6% at the same time. So it is a clear win for Arch Resources. And how many years will it take for each company to pay back its debt? Well, for Warrior Met Coal, it is under 1 year, and for Arch Resources, it's under half a year. So it's another check for Arch Resources, but in both cases, that is not a problem at all. And the final score when it comes to the financial health is 2 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. It's a draw. Revenue growth for Warrior Met Coal is 15.1%, and for Arch Resources it is only 0.4%. so it is a win for Warrior. But because this is a cyclical industry, we should be very careful with growth metrics, because results go up and down all the time, so the growth changes drastically when we move our starting point. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Let's take a look at free cash flow growth. It is a decline of 7.8% for Warrior and an impressive growth of 13.4% for Arch, so a check for them. And earnings per share growth, 1.1% for Warrior Met Coal and a decline of 11% for Arch Resources. Like I said, cyclical industries are a little bit different, and we have to remember that. So the final score when it comes to growth is 2 points for Warrior Met Coal and 1 point for Arch Resources. The dividend yield for Warrior Met Coal is 0.6% and for Arch Resources it is 5.4%, so it's a check for Arch Resources. And the payout ratio is 3% for Warrior Met Coal and 44% for Arch Resources. It is another check for Arch Resources because we are getting a much bigger portion of the earnings, but they are under 50%, so the company has still a lot of cash to invest. But since Warrior Met Coal is building a very big new mine and it does it with almost no debt, then it is understandable why the dividend is so small. And lastly, the dividend growth. It is 7.7% for Warrior Met Coal and a decline of 9.5% for Arch Resources. And those dividends change all the time because they are dependent on the performance of the company. So dividend growth is not a very meaningful metric in this particular case. And the final score concerning the dividends is 1 point for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. And now let's try to compare the valuations of both companies. And to do that, we will use an average intrinsic value per share after applying a 30% margin of safety. So the average intrinsic value per share of Warrior Met Coal is around $48, and the current share price is closer to $62. So that's an X because the current share price is higher than the average intrinsic value. And when we look at Arch Resources, we see that the average intrinsic value is around $167, but the current share price is closer to $157. So it's a check because current share price is lower than the intrinsic value. And now let's look at the percentage difference. And for Warrior Met Coal, it is minus 23.4%, so it is overpriced by around 23%. And Arch Resources is undervalued by 6.2%, so it's a clear win for Arch Resources. The final score for the valuation is 0 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. So now let's take a look at the final score. Investors. It is 3 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. Financial health, 2 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. Growth, 2 points for Warrior and 1 point for Arch Resources. Dividends, 1 point for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. And the valuation, 0 points for Warrior Met Coal and 2 points for Arch Resources. So the final score, 8 points for Warrior Met Coal and 9 points for Arch Resources. Of course, we have to remember that these results are very simplified, that they do not show the full picture. But if we look at our Stock Ranking Pro, we see that overall score for Warrior Met Coal with the valuation included, so basically the higher the number, the better investment it is currently, is right now 1.6, and for Arch Resources it is 1.8. So with two different ways of comparing the companies, we get a similar result. They are close, but Arch Resources seems a slightly better investment at the current price. If you want to learn more about Warrior Met Coal or Arch Resources, then check out my analysis of those companies. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.